Welcome. Tonight's story is one of love, power, betrayal, and a secret that shook Georgia in 1831. This is the chilling true tale of a man who gave a woman a child, and how that same woman would later take everything he ever owned. This isn't fiction, and it isn't rumor. It's built from court records, estate disputes, and testimonies history tried to bury. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And make sure to subscribe, because uncovering stories like this takes serious time, deep research, and patience to separate truth from myth. Now, let's step into one of Georgia's darkest slave betrayals. In 1831, on a sprawling Georgia plantation tucked away from the main roads, a secret began that would later destroy an entire household. It started quietly, the way most forbidden things do. The enslaved woman was young, recently brought from a neighboring estate after her previous owner's death. She was assigned to work inside the main house, close enough to hear private conversations, close enough to learn habits, weaknesses, and routines. Her owner was a widower, respected in the county, known for his sharp business sense and carefully maintained public image. To the outside world, he was disciplined and God-fearing. Behind closed doors, he was lonely, increasingly paranoid about his legacy, and deeply aware that his wealth meant nothing without an heir. At first, their interactions were ordinary, marked by the unspoken tension that always existed between enslaver and enslaved. But over time, glances lingered too long. Conversations extended beyond orders. He asked questions he had no right to ask, about her past, her thoughts, her fears. In a house built on power and silence, intimacy took on a dangerous shape. The relationship did not begin with affection, nor with romance. It began with control, with imbalance, and with a man who believed his position placed him beyond consequence. Yet something unexpected happened. The woman learned to listen more than she spoke. She observed how he drank when he was anxious, how he kept his keys in the same place every night, how he spoke of his late wife with bitterness rather than grief. She noticed how obsessed he was with his estate, his land deeds, his gold, the documents locked away in a small iron chest. What he mistook for submission was actually attention, and what he assumed was dependence slowly became awareness. As weeks turned into months, the man's behavior shifted. He began visiting her quarters at night, convinced no one would dare question him. He spoke openly then, complaining about business rivals, debts owed to him, and his fear that his wealth would eventually fall into the wrong hands. In those moments, he revealed more than he ever would to another white man. He trusted her because society told him she was incapable of betrayal. That belief would later become his greatest mistake. For the woman, the situation was unbearable yet calculated. She understood the danger of refusal and the consequences of resistance. But she also understood something else. Proximity to power was knowledge, and knowledge was leverage. In a world designed to strip her of agency, information was the only weapon she could safely carry. Each night, she memorized details. Each whispered confession became something she stored away, knowing that survival often depended not on strength, but on patience. The relationship remained hidden from the household, but not from the land itself. Rumors began to circulate among the enslaved workers, passed quietly between field rows and kitchen fires. They saw the signs, the late night footsteps, the special allowances, the protection she suddenly received. Some pitied her. Others feared the inevitable outcome, Everyone understood that such arrangements never ended cleanly. In Georgia, in 1831, a secret like this could destroy lives, especially hers. What made this situation different was the owner's growing obsession. He began speaking of legacy, of bloodlines, of continuity. He hinted that he wanted something from her that went beyond secrecy. He spoke of a child, not as an act of love, but as proof of control, as insurance against death. To him, it was a solution. To her, it was a chain that could either tighten or break, depending on how it was used. As the months passed, the power dynamic subtly shifted. He became emotionally dependent, seeking reassurance, seeking loyalty. He believed he had created something unbreakable, an arrangement where he held all authority. But what he failed to see was that by bringing her so close, by allowing her to know his fears and ambitions, he had unknowingly given her access to the very foundation of his life. This was not a love story. It was a collision between domination and survival, a relationship built on secrecy, inequality, and false confidence. The plantation continued its routines, unaware that within its walls, a slow burning betrayal was forming, not out of greed alone, but out of years of silence, coercion, and stolen autonomy. By the time anyone noticed the shift in power, it was already too late. The forbidden relationship that began as an assertion of control had planted the seeds of ruin. And in 1831, Georgia, where law protected wealth but ignored humanity, this secret would soon explode, taking reputations, fortunes, and lives with it. When the child was born, everything changed. Until that moment, the secret relationship had existed in shadows, hidden behind locked doors and late night visits. The pregnancy made it real, undeniable, and dangerous. In 1831 Georgia, an enslaved woman carrying her owner's child was not just a moral scandal. It was a legal and social threat that could unravel a man's entire standing in the county. The owner understood this immediately. What he had once treated as a private indulgence suddenly became a liability that could destroy his reputation, his estate, and his carefully constructed image as a respectable Southern gentleman. The woman, however, understood something even more important. The child changed her position forever. Before, she had been replaceable. Now, she carried living proof of his bloodline. That single fact shifted the balance in ways neither of them could openly acknowledge. The owner began to act differently toward her, more protective, more controlling, and more fearful. He moved her from the slave quarters to a small room closer to the main house, claiming it was for her health. But in truth, it was to keep her hidden from gossip and watch her closely. Every movement was monitored, every conversation overheard. He hired a discreet midwife known for silence, paying her extra to ask no questions and tell no one. On the night of the birth, the house was unnaturally quiet. No celebrations, no witnesses beyond those absolutely necessary. The baby was born alive, a boy, and the moment the owner saw him, witnesses later said his face went pale. The child looked too much like him. The resemblance was unmistakable. In that instant, the owner realized he could never fully erase what he had done. Publicly, the child was recorded as another enslaved infant, with no acknowledged father. Privately, everything changed. The owner ordered that the child be kept alive at all costs. Extra food was delivered. Warm blankets were provided. The mother was spared hard labor. To outsiders, it looked like favoritism. To the owner, it was insurance. That child was his blood, and he became obsessed with controlling what that bloodline meant. But the woman saw the deeper truth. The child bound them together, yes, but it also bound him to fear. She noticed how nervous he became whenever visitors came near the house. How quickly he shut down conversations when the baby cried. How he began locking his study more carefully, checking his iron chest twice before bed. She realized that the child was no longer just a burden to him. It was leverage. Soon, the owner began making promises. Not spoken loudly, not written openly, but whispered late at night. He spoke of freedom someday, of land far away, of protection for the boy. He hinted at documents that could be drawn up, favors that could be arranged. But every promise came with delay. Not yet. When the time is right, after certain matters are settled. The woman listened, but she did not trust words. She trusted patterns. And the pattern was clear. The more the child grew, the more dangerous the situation became, for her and for him. The owner's behavior grew erratic. At times, he treated the child with near tenderness, watching him sleep, placing a hand on his chest, as if counting his breaths. At other times, he avoided him completely, refusing to enter the room when the baby cried. He began drinking more, arguing with overseers, writing long letters that he later burned. The estate records from that year show unusual activity, land transfers delayed, debts called in suddenly, money withdrawn, and never accounted for. It was as if he were preparing for something, though no one knew what. The woman understood that the child's existence had created a ticking clock. As long as the owner lived, the boy was protected barely. But if the owner died suddenly, the child could be sold, erased, or killed without question. If the owner lived too long, the secret would eventually escape. Either way, the child was trapped between two forms of danger. Survival would require more than patience now. It would require action. Witnesses later recalled that the woman became quieter after the birth, more deliberate. She asked questions in a different way. She listened for things that weren't said. She learned who handled the owner's accounts, who witnessed his signatures, who knew where certain papers were kept. She was no longer thinking only of herself. Every decision now revolved around the child, his safety, his future, his escape from a system that would consume him the moment his usefulness ended. The owner, blinded by his belief that ownership meant loyalty, failed to see the shift. He believed the child made her dependent on him. He believed her silence meant obedience. He never considered that motherhood could sharpen resolve rather than soften it. He underestimated the power of someone who had nothing left to lose but everything to protect. By the time the child was old enough to recognize his mother's voice, the plantation itself seemed to sense the tension. Servants whispered. Overseers noticed changes in routine. The owner began sleeping with his bedroom door locked. And somewhere between the child's first cries and his first steps, a silent understanding formed in the woman's mind. The child was not just a consequence of betrayal, he was the reason for it. Because in 1831 Georgia, an enslaved woman could not fight the system openly. But she could outlast it. And if necessary, she could destroy the one man standing between her child and freedom, even if it meant taking not just his life, but everything his name and wealth had ever represented. As the child grew, the true nature of the promises made behind closed doors began to reveal itself. They were never meant to be kept openly. In 1831 Georgia, law did not recognize an enslaved woman's word, and it certainly did not protect her child, especially not a child who carried the blood of a white man but the legal status of property. The owner understood this well, which is why every assurance he offered came wrapped in secrecy. Nothing was written plainly. Nothing was witnessed by anyone who could speak freely. Everything existed in murmurs, glances, and carefully chosen moments when no one else could hear. He began by hinting at documents. He spoke of wills and trusts, as if they were abstract ideas, things that could be shaped later. He said he would see to it, that the child would never be sold, that the mother would be protected. Sometimes he went further, suggesting that freedom might one day be arranged through a third party, or that land could be quietly transferred to someone who would look after them. But whenever the woman asked how or when, the answers dissolved into vagueness. There was always a reason to wait. The courts were unstable. The timing wasn't right. People were watching. What he did not realize was that she was listening not to the promises, but to the contradictions. One night he spoke of a will already drafted. Another night he claimed it would be too dangerous to write anything yet. He said the iron chest held papers that could change everything, but then admitted those same papers could ruin him if discovered. Each inconsistency exposed fear. Each delay revealed that the promises were not protections for her, they were shields for him. Over time, he allowed her closer to the machinery of his wealth. Not intentionally, not out of trust, but out of carelessness born from arrogance. He asked her to bring him papers from his study. He spoke openly while she was present, assuming her silence was guaranteed. He complained about lawyers, about debts, about rivals who questioned his accounts. He explained how his fortune was structured, which properties were unregistered, which transactions were known only to him. He believed knowledge flowed in only one direction. He never imagined she was memorizing everything. The iron chest became a symbol of this dangerous closeness. It sat beneath his desk, heavy and always locked, yet he checked it constantly. Sometimes, late at night, he opened it while she was there, counting deeds and notes, muttering to himself. She saw names, dates, locations. She saw which documents were signed and which were not. She noticed which keys he kept on his person and which he left behind. To him, this was harmless. To her, it was a map. The more he spoke, the more he revealed that his greatest fear was not exposure, it was loss of control. He worried that if anyone learned the truth about the child, his wealth would be challenged. His estate could be divided. His name could be dragged through courtrooms and churches alike. In his mind, secrecy was the only thing keeping him safe. He believed that as long as the woman depended on his promises, she would protect his silence. He failed to see that dependence can turn into calculation when survival is at stake. The woman began to understand the unspoken rule governing everything. Nothing would be given freely. If the child was to be protected, it would not be because of love or guilt, but because of leverage. And leverage required proof. She realized that words would vanish the moment he died or changed his mind. Only documents, witnesses, and control over the truth could secure a future for her child. She started asking questions differently. Not directly, never directly, but through observation. She learned who handled his legal matters, who notarized his papers, who owed him favors. She paid attention to which men visited the house and which names caused him visible anxiety. She noticed how quickly he reacted when money went missing from accounts, how furious he became at the idea of theft. That fear, she realized, could be turned against him. At the same time, the owner's behavior grew more unstable. The weight of his secrets pressed on him constantly. He drank more, slept less, and became suspicious of everyone around him. He accused overseers of disloyalty. He locked doors that had never been locked before. He spoke of betrayal as if it were inevitable, yet never considered that it might come from the one person he believed he fully controlled. The promises, once meant to reassure, became tools of manipulation. He used them to keep her compliant, to delay action, to maintain the illusion that he alone could decide her fate and the child's future. But each promise left a trail. Each whispered assurance added to a growing understanding the man's wealth, his secrecy, and his fear were inseparable. To take one was to threaten all three. By the time the child began to speak, the woman no longer waited for promises to be fulfilled. She had learned that survival did not come from trusting power, but from mastering it. The hidden agreements, the unwritten deals, the false assurances, they were no longer obstacles. They were vulnerabilities. And in a world that denied her humanity, they became the only tools she had to reshape her destiny. What the owner never understood was that he had created the conditions for his own undoing. By hiding the truth, by refusing to act openly, by believing secrecy equaled safety, he had handed control to the one person who could destroy him without ever raising her voice. The betrayal that would follow did not come from sudden greed or malice. It came from years of broken promises, from a system that offered no mercy, and from a mother who learned that, to protect her child, she would have to take what was never going to be given. The downfall came quietly, the way true collapses often do. There was no public scandal at first, no sudden accusation shouted across the courthouse steps. Instead, people noticed small things. The owner missed meetings he never missed. Payments arrived late or not at all. Letters went unanswered. In a county where reputation was currency, even these minor lapses caused murmurs. Men who once deferred to him began to question him. Rivals who had long resented his success sensed weakness and leaned in closer, asking questions he no longer answered with confidence. Inside the house, everything was unraveling. The iron chest that once brought him comfort now seemed to torment him. He checked it obsessively, sometimes several times a night. He accused servants of touching it, of moving things, of knowing too much. His temper grew sharp and unpredictable. The woman watched all of this in silence. She did not rush. She understood that fear makes people careless, and carelessness creates opportunity. It was around this time that the money began to disappear. Not all at once. Not enough to be obvious. Just small amounts, funds redirected, notes missing, deeds misfiled. When the owner confronted his bookkeeper, the man swore nothing had changed. The records looked correct. The signatures were right. Everything appeared legitimate. That was what unsettled him most. It was as if his wealth was slipping away, without leaving fingerprints. What he did not realize was that the disappearance was built on his own habits. He had shown too much, spoken too freely, and trusted that silence was loyalty. The woman knew which transactions required his direct approval and which relied on routine authority. She understood which documents were copied and which existed only once. She had memorized names, dates, and locations long before any action was taken. When changes occurred, they were subtle enough to look like his own doing, or the mistakes of men beneath him who could easily be blamed. As weeks passed, the pressure mounted. creditors appeared unexpectedly. A land dispute surfaced involving property he believed was secure, a note he was certain he had settled resurfaced with interest added. Each problem alone was manageable. Together, they formed a trap. He spent his days trying to plug leaks, unaware that the foundation itself was shifting. The woman's position remained outwardly unchanged. She worked, she obeyed, she spoke little. But those closest to the house later recalled something different in her presence. A calm, a steadiness. While the owner unraveled, she became more composed, more deliberate. She was no longer reacting to events, she was anticipating them. Then came the moment when the fortune was truly gone. The owner went to access funds he believed untouched, assets meant to secure his future and silence any threat. They were not there, not stolen outright, not visibly taken, but transferred, reassigned, legally unreachable. The realization broke something in him. Witnesses described him sitting for hours without speaking, staring at the chest as if it had betrayed him. In a way, it had, but only because he had filled it with secrets that could be turned against him. He lashed out, accusing everyone around him. He threatened. He searched rooms. He demanded answers that no one could give. But the law, the same law that had always protected him, now boxed him in. Everything that had been done was buried in paperwork, executed through channels he himself had trusted. To challenge it publicly would invite scrutiny into matters he could not afford to expose. His child, his promises, his hidden arrangements. Silence had once been his shield. Now it was his cage. The final blow was not dramatic. It was the slow understanding that there was no path forward that did not destroy him. If he spoke, he would lose his name. If he stayed silent, he would lose his wealth. And if he tried to reclaim control by force, he would only draw attention to truths he had spent years hiding. The woman knew this. She had counted on it. By the time word spread that his estate was collapsing, the story had already taken shape. People said he had mismanaged his affairs. That age and drink had caught up with him. That he had grown careless. No one suspected the truth. That the downfall had been engineered from within the very system designed to oppress. The missing fortune became a mystery whispered about for years. Some believed it was hidden. Others said it had been stolen by outsiders. Few imagined that it had been redirected with precision, using his own secrecy as the weapon. The woman and her child disappeared from the plantation not long after, leaving behind no explanation, no trail, and no body of evidence that could be pursued without unraveling everything he feared. In the end, the owner was left with nothing but the ruins of his certainty. His wealth was gone, his power evaporated, and the betrayal he never anticipated had not come from rebellion or open defiance, but from patience, intelligence, and a mother's refusal to let her child inherit a life built on someone else's control. What followed after the collapse was a silence heavier than any accusation. The plantation that once moved with rigid precision now felt hollow, as if something essential had been stripped away. Workers noticed changes immediately. Orders were fewer. Supplies arrived late. Repairs were postponed indefinitely. Where authority had once been absolute, uncertainty now lingered. The owner withdrew from public view, avoiding church, skipping county gatherings, and refusing visitors who came seeking answers. In a society built on appearances, disappearance itself became a confession. Rumors took root quickly. Some claimed illness had weakened his mind. Others whispered that gambling debts or secret vices had finally caught up with him. No one spoke openly about the enslaved woman or the child, because to do so would mean acknowledging a truth everyone preferred to ignore. The absence of scandal was deliberate. It was easier to believe a respected man had simply failed than to accept that the system itself had been turned against him. The woman was already gone by then. She left without noise, without confrontation, taking only what could not be traced back to her. The child, whose existence had once been used as leverage, became her final reason to vanish completely. On another plantation, or perhaps beyond Georgia entirely, she blended into anonymity, in a world where enslaved people were rarely documented with care. Disappearance was not difficult. Survival often depended on becoming unremarkable. For the owner, survival meant something very different. Stripped of wealth and influence, he was forced to rely on the same community he had once dominated. But respect does not survive weakness. Men who once sought his approval now spoke of him with thinly veiled contempt. Opportunities dried up. Credit vanished. Even those who suspected the truth knew better than to voice it. To expose him would mean exposing themselves, and so the county chose collective silence. The psychological weight of that silence proved unbearable. He lived among people who knew something was wrong, but would never say it aloud. Every glance felt accusatory. Every polite conversation felt like mockery. He became obsessed with the past, replaying conversations, moments, gestures, trying to pinpoint where control had slipped through his fingers. The irony was cruel. He had believed absolute power made him untouchable, yet it was that same belief that blinded him to vulnerability. Years later, records would show a quiet end. No grand trial, no dramatic downfall recorded in newspapers. Just a man who faded into obscurity, his estate divided, his name mentioned less and less until it became little more than a footnote. History, when written by those in power, often erases the moments that challenge it most. This was one of those moments. But the legacy did not vanish entirely. Stories lingered in fragments, passed between generations in whispers. Among the enslaved, the tale was told differently, not as betrayal, but as reversal. A rare instance where knowledge outweighed violence, where patience defeated cruelty, and where a woman denied every legal right managed to claim agency through intelligence alone. The child grew up carrying a story that could never be spoken openly, yet shaped everything that followed. What made this betrayal endure was not the loss of money, but the collapse of certainty. The owner had believed the hierarchy was permanent, that fear guaranteed obedience, and that silence meant loyalty. The woman understood something deeper, that systems built on domination are fragile precisely because they depend on the belief that the dominated have no inner life, no memory, no strategy. Once that belief fails, everything else follows. There was no justice in the formal sense, no punishment handed down by courts, but there was consequence. The wealth that once symbolized power was redistributed beyond his reach. The future he had planned dissolved, and the child, who had been conceived as proof of control, became proof of something else entirely, that even in the most brutal conditions, the oppressed could still shape outcomes in ways their oppressors could never predict. In the end, the betrayal was not sudden. It was not driven by impulse or greed alone. It was the result of years of coercion, observation, and quiet calculation. It was born from a world that denied humanity while demanding obedience. And when the final silence settled over the plantation, it was clear that the greatest loss was not the fortune itself, but the illusion that power could exist without consequence, long after the people involved had vanished or faded into obscurity. The story continued to live in the margins of history, where uncomfortable truths often survive. It was never written down cleanly, never preserved in official records the way land sales or wills were. Instead, it endured through memory, distorted, fragmented, but persistent. Plantation ledgers listed losses without explanation. Church rolls recorded absences that were never clarified. Census records showed names appearing, then disappearing, as if swallowed by the land itself. To historians, these gaps looked like clerical errors. To those who understood the system, they were evidence of something far more deliberate. What made the event so unsettling to later generations was not just the betrayal, but what it revealed about power. The system of slavery depended on the belief that control flowed in only one direction. Enslaved people were meant to be visible only as labor, invisible as thinkers. Yet this story contradicted that assumption at every turn. It showed that proximity to power could be studied, that silence could be strategic, and that intelligence, when ignored, became dangerous. The woman did not overthrow the system, but she proved it was not as absolute as it pretended to be. Among descendants of the enslaved community, the story was told cautiously, often stripped of names and locations. It became less about one plantation and more about a lesson: watch carefully, remember everything, and never assume that endurance is weakness. Elders framed it not as revenge, but as survival refined into action. The child at the center of it all grew into a symbol in these tellings, not a reminder of trauma alone, but of possibility. Born into a world designed to break him, he represented a future that escaped definition by birth alone. For white descendants in the region, the story took on a different shape. It was softened, moralized, or dismissed as exaggeration. Some said the owner had been tricked. Others claimed he had simply been foolish. Rarely did anyone acknowledge the imbalance that made such an outcome inevitable. Admitting the full truth would require confronting how much violence, coercion, and denial had been normalized. Silence, once again, became the preferred inheritance. Over time, the plantation itself changed hands. Buildings were repurposed or collapsed. Fields were divided. The physical space lost its original identity, but the ground retained memory. Workers spoke of an unease around the old house, not as superstition, but as recognition. Places where injustice is concentrated tend to hold stories longer than documents do. The land had witnessed control turning inward, wealth dissolving, and certainty collapsing under its own weight. What historians later noted was how rare it was to find such a complete reversal without open violence. Most resistance narratives end in punishment or death. This one ended in disappearance and redistribution, quiet, effective, and irreversible. It challenged the popular image of resistance as loud and confrontational. Instead, it suggested that resistance could also be patient, analytical, and deeply informed. That idea was threatening because it implied that the enslaved were not merely reacting to oppression, but actively interpreting and navigating it. The moral complexity of the story refused simple conclusions. There were no heroes untouched by suffering, no villains who received public justice. What remained was a question that lingered across generations. What happens when a system built on exploitation assumes it will never be studied from below? The answer, in this case, was collapse, not through rebellion, but through exposure to its own contradictions. In modern retellings, the story has begun to surface again, not as gossip, but as case study. Scholars point to it as an example of how enslaved women, in particular, navigated layers of vulnerability with extraordinary awareness. They argue that such stories force a revaluation of historical narratives that portray enslaved people as passive figures rather than strategic actors. Each recovered fragment pushes against centuries of erasure. Ultimately, the lasting impact of this betrayal was not confined to one man's downfall or one family's survival. It reshaped how power itself could be understood. It demonstrated that even in the most unequal conditions, the flow of control was never as one-sided as it appeared. Knowledge, once gained, could not be taken back. And when knowledge met necessity, it could alter destinies in ways that laws, weapons, and wealth could not prevent. The story endures because it refuses comfort. It does not allow the past to be neatly categorized into good and evil without confronting complicity and consequence. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who rule, but also by those who observe quietly, wait patiently, and act decisively when the moment arrives.